How's it going? Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me once again on today's episode of Trad Queen Story Hour. Today, I'm joined by Jon Miltimore. Miltimore79 on Twitter. He describes himself as an irreverent writer, Christian libertarian, very nice, managing editor at Fee Online, written for the News Herald, History Magazine. Interesting alum. Okay, nice. Bylines in Newsweek, Washington Times, MSN, and NRO. And you also have a Substack. Sorry, not Substack. Where is your Substack, Jon?
It's under email jjmilt@gmail.com. It's called The Take, and I've been doing it for about 6 months now. So I publish there every day.
Oh, wow. You are very committed to what you're doing. So that is what you've been up to lately. That's awesome. How's family life been treating you lately?
Oh, it's good. You know, we've been married about, oh gosh, what is it now? I got to think, 13 years, 14 years, 3 kids. Family life keeps you busy, but it's kind of nice. Me and the wife both work from home. We actually share an office. She'd normally be sitting right over here.
Sorry you had to kick her out.
Yep, she's out here she's working on the couch right now.
Well, we appreciate her doing that for us. We'll try to keep this relatively brief. Well, it's so nice to talk to you again, Jon. I really enjoyed bringing you on to Timcast IRL. I don't know about you, but I've been following this story about Tucker Carlson, and I have a lot of theories about where he might end up. Where do you think Tucker Carlson is going to end up, and what do you think caused this firing? Because I know we saw AOC talking about crazy communist ideas about censorship and removing people from the airwaves. Do you think that had anything to do with Tucker's firing?
You know, it's a good question. I wouldn't be surprised, okay? But I'm gonna fully admit I've been reading all the spin out there, and it's hard to tell why Tucker was let go, right? Like you read some things and say like he just said no, I'm not going to do this for a segment. Like he wanted to do a segment and he got pushed back and he's like I quit. Then other people say he was fired. You're seeing like the lawsuits, like there was harassment issues, and there's all this media spin out there. And the truth is we don't know. I'm sure Tucker's going to kind of reflect on this, you know, himself in the coming days and weeks. I think, I don't remember who it was. It might've been Benny Johnson. I think he had a good take. And he did say, you know, not to poo-poo Don Lemon, but he said Lemon's career is over. Tucker's is just beginning.
That's and a great point.
I think that's going to happen. I like Tucker. I firmly believe Fox News needed Tucker more than Tucker needed Fox, and he's that big now. He's going to be able to wherever he decides to go, he's going to have huge success. I think he's going to be independent. I think he's going to be somebody that doesn't want to have a boss who's you know directing in what he can say, what he can't say. We don't need those things anymore. We have great tools, Substack, and all these publishing tools. We can kind of cut out the middleman. He doesn't need money, right? He's doing great. He's going to get paid out on that contract, it sounds like. So he's looking at about a $25 million payout or something, my guess. Yeah. Again, some of these things, there's going to be lawyers involved in all that to find out where it ends. But Tucker's going to be just fine.
For sure. And I'm very happy to hear that because I always viewed him as one of the last significant right-wing voices left. Like we had, Breitbart, and we had a few other really powerful voices, but Tucker was one of the last people who would actually engage. I think what made him different, I know he was a very compassionate person, and I keep seeing these stories where people are like, he reached out to me and he was so nice and he helped me get started and everything. I think those stories are so cool because it's so easy for those people at the top of the pile to just not care about the people who are further down or the people behind the scenes. I guess one of his last scenes on Fox was him having pizza with a pizza guy who apparently fended off a potential carjacker, which is crazy to me. I was like, that's a guy who appreciates the ordinary guy and respects them for the work that they do. I thought that was very cool. But he also would cover the stories that nobody else would touch. Do you think that led to part of his firing? Because I know one of the last things he did was talk about like Big Pharma on January 6th. Do you think the stories he covered might have been part of why he got fired?
I think Glenn Greenwald made that point really well. I don't think he talked about Big Pharma. That's one example, but you can go on all these issues Tucker would talk about, right? The war in Ukraine, the list goes on and on. Kind of these subjects that a lot of people were afraid to go after. That kind of the inside the Beltway people. There's kind of a consensus, whether you're Republican or Democrat, that you don't go after some of these things. And Tucker, was fully transparent. Like he had a shift that happened when he realized a lot of the stuff he thought a few years ago was simply not true. Where he realized, gosh, we're the bad guys in some of this, you know, and looking at the CIA, there's another one. He went there, right? Look at all the people, you know, I've been reading a book. It's called the Devil's Chessboard, and it's written by David Talbot, a great journalist, a left-wing journalist. I'll add, he wrote, I don't know if it was, I think he was like a founder of Mother Jones. In this book, A Dirty History of the CIA. And you get to look at all the things that they were doing in the 40s, the 50s, the 60s. It really probes the life of Alan Dulles, the CIA director who was clashed with John F. Kennedy over the Bay of Pigs and got ousted for it. The CIA, you know, this was something I've realized, like, just in the last few years, I've had this awakening. They're not the good guys, okay? Mm-hmm. They are involved in a lot of sinister stuff. Tucker Carlson was not afraid to talk about those things. Going back to the recordings, you know, of Nixon with the CIA director who kind of says, "Oh, I know who killed John." You know, he says at one point. And it was just a very quick thing that they quickly skirt off, and the CIA director says nothing, right? Well, Nixon doesn't last long after that. So, you know, I got a piece, actually, this is not a plug. It's just something I got to share on my Substack coming out tomorrow on the CIA. I don't know if you've noticed this, but this was something Jim Jordan released recently, that the deputy director of the CIA, former deputy director, Michael Morrell, was interviewed by several congressional committees. And he said, he's on the record, and this is what I go into in the piece tomorrow. He's on the record saying it was his intent, when they wrote that he orchestrated the Russian disinfo letter on Biden, Hunter Biden. Right. He wanted to help Joe Biden win the election. And he says that it's in the congressional testimony. And I'm just stunned we haven't had more news on that. It's been very quiet. Tucker Carlson was a guy that was reporting stuff like that. So I think his story selection absolutely had part of his, you know, it's part of the reason of his departure.
Yeah, well, that kind of reminds me of Peter Strzok and Lisa Page. And that was kind of my first inkling that something was deeply, deeply wrong here. And not to use the word deeply as like a pun, but there's a lot of talk about something that people are choosing to call now, not the deep state, but the permanent state. And that's a very hard theory to argue with, because these people stay throughout multiple administrations. It doesn't matter who's in charge. The person who's in charge is not actually in charge. And a lot goes by under the radar. Like Donald Trump was not informed about, I believe, the number of troops that we still had in certain countries, because they just chose not to tell him, because they felt they didn't have to, because there is no accountability for these people whatsoever. So
even when they're caught, right? Like even when they're caught red-handed, like Strzok and Page were, in Morrell, it's the same thing. Like we talked about, he was talking to Tony Blinken, who was involved in the Biden campaign.
Right.
This is what got this letter going. Like, this is direct communication, and they were blaming it on the Russians, but they were the ones that were meddling in elections here. And at some point, I realized they're the Praetorian Guard of ancient Rome, right? It was the Praetorian Guard who had the power, not the emperors. At some point, you know, like the emperors were people. You know, there was times in one year you'd have 3 or 4 emperors, because the guard's like, okay, he's got to go. And right. You know, like, Americans need to realize real quickly, these U.S. intel agencies, as you say, they're not being held accountable, and they're involved in things they shouldn't be. They should not be involved in domestic operations like this.
Right. Well, and there are cases to be made that they probably shouldn't be orchestrating coups in other countries too. Although that's a completely different kettle of fish.
Yeah, and I totally agree with that, for the record. Here's the thing for me. It was one thing knowing, like, okay, the CIA's toppling governments in the Congo, right? And like, which they did, and they helped orchestrate the assassination of Lumbamba, the prime minister there. Seeing that, you know, learning that decades later, okay, and it was all done in secret, like, that's shocking. But when you're seeing it in real time, and nothing's happening, it's crazy. And I give a hat tip to Matt Taibbi, he's where I kind of, he just had a Substack this morning, I think it came out, which is where I kind of first saw this. Jim Jordan letter, and it's like he said, we're witnessing. I hate to sound hyperbolic here, but this is what he Tybie's a journalist who's very good, and I don't think he is a hyperbolic guy. He said we're witnessing the Sovietization of America. And like where this stuff, these intel agencies, it's not even being done in secret anymore. Like we're seeing it. But because of the incentives in media right now, the only people that are touching it are sort of like right-wing, organizations, media. You're not seeing the New York Times there. You're not seeing the Washington Post or 60 Minutes.
Yeah, I have to say, I think that the reason, I think that it's a sign of how deeply flawed our mainstream media is that no one cares at all about this Blinken revelation, or no one seems to be really interested in covering it. I think Fox News touched on it a little bit, at least in passing, although obviously my opinion of Fox News has just fallen off the charts over the course of the last 24 hours. But they're one of the only organizations who is even willing to entertain a discussion about it, which it shocks me, but also it doesn't, because I'm unbelievably cynical at this point. Like I've been doubting the mainstream media for 2 decades, and I'm only 3 decades old. So I'm like, where does this end? How extreme can it get? It just seems to be amping up. Is there any end in sight? Do you think that the election in 2024 could halt this ridiculous permanent state situation?
I don't think an election is going to do it. I do think something else is going on. I've learned not to put much hope in elections. Like I just think they're too hard to predict. But here's another example. Like the actor Tim Robbins, I saw on Twitter yesterday morning at like 4 a.m. He tweets this awesome tweet, and it's like he's calling out. He's a Democrat. He's a Bernie Sanders supporter. He is calling out Democrats who are threatening to imprison, Matt Taibbi over that, his congressional testimony and Twitter files. He's calling them out on Twitter by name. He's tagging them. He's calling out mainstream media, saying, "Where are you guys? If you had any accountability left, it's gone. Like this is the free press we're talking about." He said they are the ones doing this reporting about this sort of invisible state that's involved in censoring information, and you're attacking them for it. So I think seeing people like that, that they're also waking up to this, and seeing like some of these, Tim Robbins and I probably don't agree a whole lot on politics, but he's kind of an old school liberal who still does cherish freedom, free press, free speech. Like kind of like in the Glenn Greenwald vein. I think there's probably stuff on me and Glenn. He's not like a classical liberal in the sense I am. He supports too much state intervention, but they do have good principles, and they put their principles over politics. And getting more people like that speaking out on this, I think that is how this comes down. And at some point, I do believe at some point there's going to be enough people, even in traditional media, that when they see some of these things gaining steam, they're going to flip and they're going to start doing their job and report about the things government's been doing.
I truly hope you are correct. I am a little bit optimistic because journalism has obviously been co-opted, and people are now so incurious. Like, for example, Don Lemon had no idea he was going to be fired. You would think that somebody who pretends that he's somewhat in the loop about most things would at least be kind of informed about what's going to happen to him down the line. But I know sometimes things aren't fully disclosed to people before they happen. But I think that hopefully this does start a trend. And I do have utmost respect for people like Matt Taibbi and Glenn Greenwald, with whom I do not agree on pretty much anything, but I feel like they are the revolutionaries fighting this battle kind of solo, which is troubling. It feels like we're in a dystopian novel, which leads me to my next point that I wanted to talk to you about. And the reason I hit you up in the first place is because you were talking about Brave New World and how you're kind of like seeing echoes of that in today's world. So you want to unpack that for us? How do you think that is?
Yeah, first let me just say I love fiction. Like, a lot of people are like, oh, it's fiction, it's not real. How can you read that stuff? And if you look, fiction always teaches us stuff. It teaches us truth, right? It's designed. The stories might be fake, but they're designed to teach us truth. You can look at Little Red Riding Hood, right? Like it's designed with a moral. Like, you know what? There are wolves lurking out there. Be careful. Don't trust everyone. All these stories have morals, and Brave New World is different. Is no different. Huxley wrote that as sort of, I think, as a counter to like watch out for the utopianists, right? Like watch out for these people that are trying to design and centrally plan this perfect world. In the article I looked at, it was through the lens of education, because, for people who haven't read the book, you have, education. We're not talking media, we're talking education here has been co-opted by the state, and they have, from when the birthing process itself, like the state's involved in all of it, and you have these kids who are sitting in their little classrooms, and it's not just in classrooms; they're actually being taught in their sleep. Okay, that's Huxley has a name for it, like hypnodia, and they realize like this doesn't work well if you're actually trying to teach kids important stuff. Like if you're trying to teach them intellectual education, they can't keep any of it. But they learn if you're trying to teach moral education, they soak it all right up. And what are they learning? They're learning like class consciousness. They're learning elementary sex. They're learning all these things that the kids just soak up. Again, it's not real education. And they show like when they try to give kids that, they just kind of break down. They crumble. They can't. But they take all these moral lessons and as I say, they soak them up. And you see here, education, like it asks an important question, like what is the purpose of education? And you have thinkers from Cicero to Ben Franklin that thought, well, education, we should give kids good values, right? I'm a little skeptical of that approach, especially today, because we can't agree on what are good values. Right. And I think what we're seeing is, okay, like we've been doing that for a long time. It was about character. It was about all these things. Well, now virtue is very different today. And they're getting a lot of moral education, a lot of virtue education in schools. And they're not getting a lot of education beyond that, right? We've all seen the test scores. We've all seen like these schools where 80% of people can't read at a basic level. Yeah. And I think Huxley was warning us: beware of people who want to use education to serve themselves, right? And that's what the real message is. They're not trying to teach the kids in the novel anything good to them. Like only the elite class, like the directors and stuff, can read about literature and art and history. It's the children that are being programmed, and today, like kids, it's sad. They're not learning a lot about history. They're not learning a lot about art and all these things. They're learning a lot of stuff, slogans, all that stuff that in a lot of social justice, to be honest, right? Like I have kids in school, and I like, we fortunately have a good charter schools around here. We have good school choice, but you really can't escape it. I don't care if you're sending your kids to private schools or charter schools or public schools. They're gonna encounter some of this, and it's alarming.
So have you, it strikes me, I was going to ask how you've chosen to educate your kids, since that's such an interesting topic at this particular time. I'm really glad you're in a place that allows such freedom of, association when it comes to school. Do you find that like a fundamental curriculum teaching parents how to teach their kids how to look for this kind of stuff, do you think that would be helpful to have? Something that the right wing could put together to kind of keep parents in the loop if, for example, they do have to send their kids to public schools, if both parents have to work or whatever?
Yeah, like how you choose to educate your children is different, or a difficult decision, right? It's just one of those. I think every family is going to choose what's best for them, and I've flirted with homeschooling. I've flirted with it recently. I've really thought seriously about it, but my wife's like, if we do this, you'll have to be the teacher. She said, I cannot do that. And both me and my wife, we have careers, and like right now, we've decided the best thing we can do is both work. But I think for other families, they're going to reach a different thing and say and I do that because we have, like, my daughter goes to a really good Montessori school right up the road, and a lot of people would have to pay to go that school. We don't even have to, it's a charter school, but, I believe in the self-directed learning of the Montessori, model.
I like that. Yeah. I like that idea.
My youngest son's probably going to go there as well. So we do have those options. As far as like parents, like, FEE, my organization, the Foundation for Economic Education, Carrie McDonald, she literally wrote the book on unschooling. Okay. Like she went to Harvard. She wrote a book called Unschooling, and it's sort of, it embraces this model of parents just getting their kids, sort of out of the crazy rat race of the system and letting them learn through these kind of non-traditional models. I'd encourage anyone to read that book. It's, I have it on my shelf behind me here. It's if you're exploring that, it's a book that can equip you, with some of the decisions you're going to want to make.
Awesome. What's her last name?
Carrie McDonald. And I've been working with Carrie for probably 6 or 7 years now, even before I was at FEE. And she is one of the smartest people I've ever met. And like I said, it's kind of fun. Like, she did her graduate degree at Harvard. She's really, she knows this stuff, and she's thought about it. And she writes a weekly column at Forbes and at FEE. And when I have questions on education, I get Carrie on the phone.
That's fantastic. Well, it sounds like she's had the full experience with not just education, but also with higher education. And she still wrote this book about unschooling, which is a really interesting topic. I feel a little bit concerned about unschooling because I personally need a little bit of structure myself. I'm not even sure how I would handle Montessori, although I do appreciate having flexibility and being super hands-on. I feel like that kind of education needs to be really specifically tailored to your kid. And that's a choice that every parent should be making. Did you see what Joe Biden said the other day?
No.
Holy cow. He said, oh my gosh, what did he say? He said, children are everyone's children. They're not your kids. They're everyone's kids. And I told my husband this, and he was like, what? And I was like, yeah, because my husband is a libertarian. He's an anarchist. Like, this does not vibe with him at all. He's not a big fan of this. And I can imagine that parents of every race, color, and creed are just going to bristle at that so hard, because you can't go through labor, deliver a child, go through the sleepless nights, raise the kid, go through toddlerhood, and then have the president of the US tell you that that's actually not really your kid. We need to educate that kid to our standards so that he will be a good part of our society. This is kind of like when they talk about our democracy. And this is something I noticed early on. When they say our democracy, they are not including people like you, John, or me, Lydia. They are including themselves. That's theirs. Everything that we do is outside of that, which is troubling. I've never liked a president less than I like Joe Biden, which is really saying something, especially because he says things like, it's not your child, it's everyone's child. And he fights stuff like school choice, which is amazing to me. Is there even an argument against school choice? Because I'm really trying to put myself in the shoes of someone who disagrees with school choice fully. Do you know?
Are there arguments for it? Yeah, sure. Like you hear the teachers unions. You can go listen to Randy Weingarten on Twitter and get all those arguments. They're not good arguments,
right?
And let me just say, I think there is. This is an issue I've been around for 20 years now. Okay. And I've never seen this much momentum or excitement behind school choice. It is actually happening now. It's happening because of what we're seeing in schools. The stuff we're just just talking about here, like the sort of like the indoctrination, the social justice, like just kind of all that stuff creeping in. Parents are aware of it like they hadn't been before, and it's gotten worse too. So right. Parents are receptive to this, and it's not just Republican parents, or it's not just libertarian parents. You go in, you have very blue cities, and parents that are in these struggling schools. You're damn right they want options, and they are behind this. They're helping to grow those movements. They're happening in states all across the country. So I think this is one of the areas to be just excited about. We're seeing great things now. There is a danger. Like we've had, discussions about this at FEE as well. School choice, I think, is really important. There are people I know who, more in the anarchist vein, who share, I think, very genuine concerns that this could be a Trojan horse for the state to get more control over education.
Right. I have heard that. I've heard that.
And so that like there is something now. I'm of the mind like let's just take some victories where we can and worry about those things and prepare for those things. But at the same time, I do have just we need some wins. We need to give parents real choices. Like especially when their kids are in these failing schools.
There's certainly an argument to be made that if you introduce this kind of thing, you can further convince people that it's the right option. And this is something that I was really enjoying when Trump was in office. I was like, look, we're starting to put some of the policies, some, not all of them, but some of the policies that I personally have believed in my whole life, and they're working great. People are succeeding. The amount of economic independence is staggering. Everyone's happy. Like, it genuinely felt like America was really growing and changing. But I think something similar could be said when it comes to school choicing. Once you give parents a little taste of that, they'll start to be like, oh, this is really good. And yes, I have heard the anarchist/libertarian argument that this could be a way for the state to get their foot in the door as far as charter schools or private schools, to which I have to say, that's great to be aware of. We can cross that bridge when we get to it. We really need to give people options, because I was reading the stats and they pour thousands, something like almost $30,000 per student in Baltimore, and they have abysmal rates. Like, their literacy rates are through the floor. And it's like, okay, so it turns out that dumping money into this issue is not actually going to fix it, which I could have told you since I was like 10 years old, but apparently needs to be proven again and again. But it's because
our children are way too precious a resource to turn over to government to say, okay, please. And this was something we should have learned a long time ago. It's tragic that we didn't learn this a long time ago. And I just want to agree with something you said earlier, about like a parents, deciding, different kids are going to thrive in different models, right? I think that's something Carrie would totally agree with as well. Like, different models are going to work for different kids. And that's why, a couple of my kids, I think, are great for the charter school or the Montessori model. My middle son's not, he's like you, he needs more structure. Like, if you just told him, like, he kind of needs to be directed. And so he's in a different school. And I think parents are able to make those decisions. And the key is to not have this one size fits all model. And to say, well, you're stuck. There's where you're going. And having a marketplace for schools is so important. You see schools, the principals, like, they actually are interested in what you say when you could take your kids somewhere else, right? Like, there's an incentive there for them to listen to you, instead of just a typical bureaucracy says, nope, that's tough. That's how it is. You get on board or get lost, or maybe you even can't get lost because they're the only game in town, and you're legally required to send your kid to a school. So at least having a marketplace makes schools compete for children and to listen to parents.
I think that's a great point, because this really puts the power of the free market and actual capitalism, not crony corporatism, but actual capitalism, the free market of ideas, and the option, giving people options. Because I worked in a hospital for like forever, for like 10 years, the first half of my career. And one of the things I noticed was that you are, of course, your own best advocate, because who cares more about what happens to you than you do? And this really translates to pretty much every part of life. No one cares more about a kid than their parent. A parent who is raising their kid correctly anyway. I have to say, this is one of my pet peeves, and hopefully you can offer some kind of solution or hope for this, because it troubles me deeply that parents will have the child and then immediately put them into daycare and then kindergarten and then government schools for their entire lives. And when they come home at the end of the day, they get an iPad and out of the parent's hair. And that shocks me. Like, why did you even have a child if you are giving it to the state and just saying, here is a new widget for you to foist your ideas upon. I don't care what you teach them. Take it away. That stuns me. How do we fix that? That's such a huge cultural problem.
No, it is. And I think that you're getting at, like, just to go back to, Huxley a little bit, we're living in some ways in a dystopian society. And here's an example. You do have kids that are struggling with anxiety and mental health like we've never seen before. And that's something anybody, left, right, everybody kind of agrees on that. Now we might have different, theories on why it's happening, but I think the primary reason is just what you're saying. Like, parents aren't doing their jobs. We're just kicking the kids off to daycare or into government schools or programs. Parents need to step up, and it's not just about showing love for your kids. I think all parents are going to love their kids. It's about showing them, instilling them with good values. I had a conversation with two friends recently on this. Like, they're both fathers. They're both just started going to church again. They're Catholics.
That's
I'm not
great.
Catholics, but they are. And we talked about it. And I said the one lesson I've taken away: if you don't give your kids any values, the culture will. And the culture's value, they're not good values. And your kids are going to suffer. And just to make a personal note here, this is a private thing. My daughter's 11. She'll be 12 soon. And she's a great kid. She's so well adjusted. She's, in wonderful gymnastics, all these things. But I see, like, sometimes in her school, like, there's, a young girl, she's 11, she's cutting herself. Okay, let's just, and I'm like, she's 11. And I just found this out. And I thought, my wife said, I never knew a single person, not one, like that cut themselves growing up. What's going on when this is common? You can, I don't have the stats at my fingertips, but this isn't that unusual. We have all these kids doing this, this sort of self-harm. Like, this is like a symptom of like a dystopia, right? Like, this is an unhealthy society, an unhealthy culture. So as parents, love your kids more than anything else, but make sure, like give them more than just love. Give them good values. Help them in this culture that is very ugly in a lot of ways. They're going to need you. Don't just put them on a phone, like you say, and let them play. They need outdoor play. They need to find the good. There's plenty of good in this world. We still live in a world that I think is so beautiful. There's so much great stuff, but parents need to really step up and make sure their kids are finding the beauty out there and not all this ugliness that we're seeing.
Yeah, I keep running into this wall because I'm really interested in the culture, right? Because it looks to me like if we're not going to fix the actual problem that's behind the symptoms, there's almost not a point to even discussing the symptoms, because if you don't get to the heart of it, if you don't cure the disease, there's no point in putting a Band-Aid on, the symptom. So I keep coming back to this significant problem, and I just don't have a solution to this. And I'll pick your brains a little bit about this, and then I want your top 3 books. We'll get into that in a minute. How do we change the culture so that people want to stay married and want to go to church and want to engage with their community? I feel like we're missing a significant tool in our arsenal by not having religion and lacking that kind of religious structure. So how can we kind of bring that back? Is there any subtle cultural way to encourage church attendance and getting married and having kids and stuff like that?
No, that's a huge question. Like, I think people just need to relearn the value of faith, and if you look, there was some numbers out there, like Gen Z's heading back to church. I don't know if you saw that, but there's some really promising numbers. And I look at that as good. I go to church, not to like make God happy. I go to church because I need God. Like, right. I need that in my life. And I, at some point, you go as a kid, they pull you into church. And at some point I realized, like, oh, I'm not doing this because I have to go. I'm doing this because I need it. And it fills a hole, like Pascal talked about the God-shaped hole in all of us. I think what we're seeing in our culture is that there is that hole, but people are filling it up with everything else, right? You'll alcohol or drugs or porn or anything but what they should be. And I think we do, if you look at American history, there has been this ebb and flow of this. And I think what we really need is a great awakening. Like, we've had 2 or 3 of those great awakenings. We need to have that. How that happens, I don't know. Like, I'm not a minister. I think culture is complicated. I think, what we first need to recognize is we need to turn our back on false idols, right? The Bible talks all about all these false idols, and looking at our lives, and where are our false idols? What else are we worshiping? I think a lot of people worship politics. A lot of people worship the state. A lot of people are worshiping things. And it starts on recognizing that and seeking the truth. And I think, if we do that, you will see people, I think, gravitate back toward that. And I think it's just so important because if you look, Christianity flourished in ancient Rome. And I often thought, like, look at this, is this little religion that started from nothing. How did this take off? But I think if you looked, Roman culture didn't offer anything like that. It was just very brutal and ugly. And Christianity offered something that made it spread like nothing we'd really seen in history before. I think we're starting to slide toward Rome a little bit, and if you can see the ways our society mirrors ancient Rome, but it doesn't mean we have to go that way. And I would say, even if it does, like, this is what I think there are times I look at the culture and I'm saying, you know what? Maybe I can't save the culture, but God's plan's his plan. It's not mine. But what I can do is work on fixing myself. And by fixing myself, I fix the people around me. I raise good kids, and they're going to, in turn, like share good things. And that is the beauty of religion. I thought of this recently. We go to church, we tithe, we do all this voluntary. Nobody's making us. Nobody's making us do this, like the state that extracting your money, and that this false religion of social justice, they're always going to take from you and build it that way. Religion's voluntary, and sharing something good, like the gospel with others, is just something that's how you can turn things around. But it's going to be difficult.
Right. The other thing I think that nobody wants to hear is that it's going to take a really long time. Unfortunately, it's not like a 6-month fix. It's not a one election fix. It's probably a couple generations. And I use this analogy. I don't even know if it's actually an analogy, but I use this turn of phrase almost every show because I think that we're heading into hard times. I don't know if you've heard the term hard times create strong men, right? Strong men create good times create weak men. We are in very good times. We want for nothing except for actual fulfillment. And I think that's what is going to drive us into hard times. And I'm constantly harping on the fact that it's such a silver lining that our children and our children's children are going to be very strong people. And I'm actually pretty excited for that. I think that's a wonderful thing. One of the other things about Rome when Christianity was first spreading was that there was intense persecution, like actually martyrdom. And you could be killed for believing this. And people chose to anyway. If anything, that motivated them to believe in this because they saw people who believed it so much so that they were willing to die for it, which is frankly inspiring, I think, to the human spirit and something that we lack. So
the blood of the martyrs, like we're told, like nothing pleases more than that. I made a joke on Twitter. I'm not a victimhood guy, but I did make just this observation. I'm like, it's crazy. The only time I've ever experienced bigotry in my life is on Twitter. Where people, anti-Christian bigotry. And I said, It's kind of jaw-dropping when you realize some of these people, they would literally feed you to lions if they could. Like they would have no problem with that. And like there's this just clear hostility, and I'll never understand it, because to me, like as a Christian, this is where my libertarianism and my Christian faith came together. If you look, like Jesus was just trying to share things with people. Jesus was never like no, well, she's misbehaving, we're gonna have to stone her. No. Like there was, even people that wanted to follow, he'd say, well, do this if you want to follow, and if that person couldn't, like the rich man, okay, goodbye. There was that. It's a voluntary aspect, and there's something beautiful in that. Take this because it's good, and if you don't want to, that's okay.
Right.
And I even think like the Apostle Paul had a great message. Again, this was sort of something like that spoke to my libertarian heart. Like all others, apostles were all worried, like, well, what should we do about the Romans? As far as their marriage and like, should we be, he said, don't worry about them. He said, we're to worry about the church. And,
Right.
and there's something, again, like a voluntary thing, like within the church, we got to kind of look and say like, what are we called on? What does God want us to do? But Paul wasn't saying like, oh, you got to go get the church to really take marriage seriously, or infidelity, these things. And that's where I'd like to see the church come around. I can say like the church is kind of wayward right now, right? Like they're really sucked into the world, into the culture. And Jesus always talked about being, no. The world is going to go its own way, right? Like we're not of the world. We're supposed to be, part of it, and but we're not supposed to worry about all these earthly things. We're creatures of spirit. And I think the church needs to kind of remember that.
That is a great point. I think the American church, we could do an entire hour on them because they are severely lacking. And I chalk that up fully to having lived in such good times. Now, my parents, I was raised in a Christian church. I was raised Protestant. I was raised in a Presbyterian church. My parents were constantly telling me and my 5 siblings that, you know what, we are very blessed to live when we do. They were constantly telling us about how people in other countries face serious persecution. We would talk about Rome. We would talk about Paul being imprisoned. And we would talk about all this other stuff. So it was kind of driven home to me that we lived in very special times. And that made me very grateful, right? So it made me really appreciate what we have today. And I think that in order for the Christian church to be effective, there needs to be, unfortunately, I feel like there have to be hard times to keep the American church on their toes. And I think that hard times might be one of the things that drives people back to the church, because I suspect as we lose access to, all the little modern conveniences we've grown accustomed to, we might look around and say things like, what is real, right? So Ben Shapiro was talking about how they did a study of who the happiest people in the country are. There are people who are married, or who respect the institution of marriage. There are people who are religious, or likewise respect the institution of religion. There are people who focus on their culture, and people who care about money, but who are not overtly fixated on it. And I was like, that does sound like a recipe for happiness, and it is the opposite of everything our culture tries to tell us. So, I don't know. I don't
It's
know
kind of the
how
history that, just to interject, it's kind of the history of the Jewish people, right?
Yeah.
Like the Jewish people, it's this big long story, and they'd be suffering, then they get released. Like, oh, we're so grateful. Well, then things would turn good, and they turn away from God. And it's
Yep.
always the same story. They turn away from God, and then things get bad again. Even when Moses just disappears for a while to go to Mount Horeb and get the 10 Commandments, he comes back and all hell's broken loose, right? Like, come on, you just saw miracles, and you're already going wayward like this. So we shouldn't be surprised that humans in the 20th century, 21st century, America, amid all this, that we suddenly find ourselves turning wicked and falling to pieces, and in the culture really struggling. That is kind of the human story, but even in that, we'll see great things happen, right? We see great, here we think it's, bad now, because I think partly we lived in this, I slip into Gen X, right? And I grew up in the 80s and I loved it. I just thought
Right.
it was just this sort of like the Pax Americana, this great time in history when we kind of had put the 60s were behind us, and things weren't crazy yet. And it was a great time, and seeing that kind of fall apart is hard. But look at the 20th century, look at, World War I, the Great Depression, World War II. It looked like constant conflict and struggle. So even though we're going through a rough patch, just don't forget how good we really have it. And is there a crisis of meaning upon us? I think there is. But individuals with open hearts seeking truth, I think they can, find their way even in an environment like this.
For sure. And you mentioned living in a time of unbelievable peace. And that's another thing that I harp on probably too much. I actually want to read some really good history books, because I'm constantly reminding people of what it used to be like. Like, we complain about, for example, consent culture and no means no and stuff like that. And I'm like, do you realize the percentage of people who exist because no did not, in fact, mean no at the time? This was a cultural trend. Like, if you don't understand humanity, you are easily twisted to believe that America is uniquely evil for the crime of having slavery, which was a global phenomenon at the time. And America was one of the first countries to get rid of it. They're not taught that. They are only taught that the US is evil because that was a problem, a stain on our history. We did get rid of it. Again, not disclosed. So I wanted to ask you, on the topic of history, what are your top 3 books, fiction or nonfiction, that you would recommend to people? You seem like a very, very well-read man. I remember, especially on Timcast RL, I love hearing about people who've read awesome books and come out and recommend them. I would like to read more. What do you think are your top 3?
Oh, that getting it down to 3 is tough. I do love books. I'm just going to say 3 right now off the top of my head. One is a fun little novel written by David Benioff, who, if people know that name, he was the Game of Thrones creator, right? For HBO. Oh. George Martin wrote the books and they're fabulous, but Benioff and DB Wise took that to HBO and turned it into a series. And he has this book called City of Thieves. And it's just a short novel about 200 words. And it's about a soldier and a civilian, in Leningrad during World War II. The city's under siege by the Nazis and they're trapped in this city with no food. And they have to go find eggs for like a commissar who's having a wedding. So you got this crazy plot, right? You got to find in this starving city a dozen eggs so they can make a cake, or they're going to be dead. So it's a hilarious book, even though it's sort of this dark backdrop. It is a hilarious book and it moves really fast. I love that book. There's a book behind me on my shelf, and that one is too, but one I just gave to a friend, Alexander Hamilton by Ron Chernow, is just an amazing, it's probably the best biography I've read. It is the inspiration for the famous, Broadway play Hamilton. And if you want to understand America and the American founding, I think it's not just a great biography. It shows you the caliber of the men. And Hamilton, it is funny, libertarians can't stand Hamilton because he kind of set up this big, kind of more powerful federal infrastructure, right? Economic infrastructure than was kind of promised. But he was so brilliant. In the biography, you read his story, and you do realize like these were giants. Like it was something for a long time I didn't appreciate. You kind of like, well, there's just, they were at this crucial time in history. That's why we remember them. And you're like, no. These were brilliant men. And let's see, what would be a third? Well, I'll just say, I'm going to name just what I think is the greatest American novel. And this one will surprise people. But if you ask me the greatest American novel, I think it's Gone with the Wind. And really? I didn't read it for a long time. I'd seen the movie, half a dozen times. And finally, I'm like, you try to go and read all these books that are Pulitzer Prize winners and, like these sort of like classic works that need to be read. And it was a more modern book than I could have believed. Like there was stuff in there that I'm like, oh my gosh, this was published in 1920, I can't remember. And I could not believe it held up so well. So I'm going to say a fourth. I know you only asked for 3, but I think
give 4. Yeah.
The greatest novel I think ever written. I might lose people with this, but Nabokov's book, Lolita, is, I just think, a masterpiece. It is just a masterpiece. Again, a book I picked up on a whim. And it's just a literary work that, again, the subject matter is really bad. Like this kind of like, cause but they're not celebrating this in the book. It's exploring the human mind. And just a couple econ books. I love, I get asked a lot, my favorite econ book, Basic Economics by Thomas Sowell is the most accessible econ book I think that will, for any beginner. It's wonderful. Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson is another one. I love both of those, and Ludwig von Mises's Human Action is another one. I love talking books, and it's like one of those things when you find other book lovers, just talking about things that moved you. And then I love giving recommendations, but other people, when they give them to me too, it's always fun to hear, because books move us, right? They shape us. When I go to people's houses, one of the first things I do is I look at their bookshelf, because I say you can tell a lot about them by what books are on their shelves.
Yes, you would enjoy my husband's bookshelf. He has a lot of Rothbard, he has a lot of
Nice.
computer programming books for my sins. But he has a lot of really, really deep, intense books that I cannot claim to have read all of them.
I'm trying to get my dad to read Rothbard. My dad's just, I think, a budding libertarian, but I think Rothbard, out of all of them, I think he would just love. So I got Father's Day coming up. That's what I might have to get for him.
There you go. That's awesome. And I like the idea too of Audible, because the way that it's more accessible to me, because I like to walk, and we have a little puppy who needs to walk, which means that I'm out there walking a lot. So like, I want to listen to stuff. I think Audible is such a good way to do that. Thank you for your recommendations.
You know,
oh, awesome. What kind?
Got a Cavalier King Charles, and he's about cute. 9 months. And yeah, he is a cute little, my daughter had been begging for years. So finally she broke me down. I said, you know what? I just want to see her get a puppy to see. And we have it on video, and she just starts to bawl. It got me so choked up, you know.
That's so cute. I love to hear that. I love the idea of kids having dogs when they're young. We got this little one before we have kids, so I'm going to do my best to have her fully trained by the time any little ones come along, and make sure that there's no danger to either party. Got to make sure we got to contain that puppy energy. She's part Schnauzer, part Shih Tzu. She's a ball of energy, and I just
that's how ours is. Like, Cavaliers are supposed to be kind of laid back. Well, this guy, he is not. And you think he's a hunting dog, like he just wants to chase birds outside. He just wants he is just wound up. But dogs are good, and they can teach little kids a lot on responsibility and all that good stuff.
Yes. Dogs, like books, teach us a lot about ourselves and are a very important part of the human experience. Yeah, Will Chamberlain is also great about reading. He would always come on Timcast IRL and talk about what he'd been reading lately. And I love that, because love Timcast as I do, there wasn't as much reading as I would have loved to have seen. I love being ensconced among people who enjoy books and who kind of encourage other people to read them. Such an important kind of lost art. Reading was something that me and my siblings, literally, my parents would punish us when we got too big to be spanked. They would punish us by removing our ability to read, which I thought was cruel and unusual punishment. Yeah. But, we would just be under the covers or whatever, reading whatever at the time. And then we would talk about them with my dad. Like, we would discuss it. My dad could not believe that I had read a Brian Jacques novel in like 2 days. He sat down with me and he's like, so what's the plot of this book? So I walked him through it, and he's like, you read that in like a day and a half. And I was like, yeah, it's a great book. Okay, he's a great author. I felt like I was getting the 9th degree, but I was so engaged with it at the time. I really want to find a way to make that last into adulthood. And maybe part of being a kid, I don't know how much your kids like to read, but having the free time of youth is really a great time to get them engaged with reading. You seem like the right person to do that with them. John.
It's funny, just the last point. I think, nothing was more important to my education than reading books. And my dad got me my dad's a bookworm, got me reading. It kind of started with like J.R.R. Tolkien and that stuff. But I think I was a poor student in middle school and high school. Once I was in college, I became a good student, but I was a bad student, but I was very well read, and I think that's that's the only reason I was able to kind of turn things around.
Right. And now you write as well. And I think those two are constantly hand in hand. Being verbally acute is a very, very important part of processing the world. So good for you. Hopefully your kids have that as well. And hopefully they like
working on it.
Yeah, I know it takes work sometimes. It's especially hard in a world so full of flashy digital devices. And it's hard to kind of balance that out. But I'm sure they will be just fine. John, again, thank you so much for joining today. I really appreciate your input.
Thanks for the invitation, Lyds.
Yeah.
It's been a long time since we talked, but I appreciate the invitation. I always appreciated you too, getting me on Timcast, because that was such a cool experience. But yeah, you're doing great work, and I hope your podcast just keeps crushing it.
Thank you very much. I will start to recommend you for the next month at least. I'll recommend you on my Substack. Yeah. And then people will join you. I've been slowly ticking up in the numbers too. It's one of those things you just got to stick with, which I think is fine. Nothing good comes fast, but very, very important to bear with it. John, do you want to tell people where they can find you and what you're working on as we wrap it?
Yeah, no, like you can find all our work at fee.org. You know, we publish on Fee every day as well. If you're interested in the libertarian philosophy, if you're interested in economics, check us out. And my own, Substack is jjmilt at gmail.com. It's under the take. And yeah, like I publish there every day. So, like I'm trying to, like Lydia said, just watching, growing that audience on Substack is a lot of fun. And, give me a follow there if you're listening.
Absolutely. Substack is a platform that needs a lot more attention because they are huge purveyors of free speech, which is dangerous now, I guess. So good that you're over there, and I would like to see more people get involved. Audience, thank you so much for joining us. I hope you appreciated this libertarian take on dystopia and books and all this other cultural stuff that we're looking at today. Jon is such a cheerful person, so hopefully he left you with a little bit of a silver lining overall. I will see you guys tomorrow night. Until next time, bye guys. How's it going?